Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all well, and thank you very much for joining us. This afternoon, we have the EU Public Affairs Insider Series hosted and brought to you by John Harper Publishing. I will run through a little bit of what we're going to be doing today. So today is the topic is how to engage the European Parliament. We have two fantastic presenters, Joost Mulder and Doro Francesco, who both contributed to the two books published by John Harper Publishing. We'll have a chance for Joost and Doro to give some presentations at the beginning and run through some of the highlights of the books. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. In order to allow as many questions as possible, it'd be great if you could pop your questions into the chat. If you could direct them either to Joost or to Doro. And if we can try and make them as succinct as possible so we can get through as many questions as possible. With that in mind, I'd like to hand over to John Harper of John Harper Publishing, who is bringing us these seminars, and the publisher of the two books, How the EU Institutions Work and How to Work with the EU Institutions. Over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Nick. Just a couple of points, not to hold up the presentation. First of all, a big thank you from me and from everyone associated with this project to Doro and Joost for their time and trouble they've taken to create these presentations. This is very much a labour of love by the presenters. The only reward they get is really our appreciation as an audience and the knowledge that they're helping to improve the quality of how people do their jobs. So a very real expression of thanks to them for their dedication to the cause, really. And just a reminder, if you're not familiar with their websites, please do visit the Vote Watch and Better Europe websites, which will give you a fuller idea of the tremendous work that Doro and Joost are both engaged in their different ways. My second point is, as Nick has mentioned, these presentations take us the starting point, the two new books, which are becoming called the Orange Book and the Purple Book, covering how the institutions work and how to work with the institutions. We do get asked by people where they can get hold of these books when they're on their flying visit to Brussels with no time to trail around bookshops. So I thought I'd just pick out three locations today which are of particular relevance for this session, which is on the European Parliament. One of the places is in the European Parliament, in Brussels, in the Spinelli building, in the press shop, which is on the main sort of shopping concourse in the Spinelli building. And I'm just going to, this is a picture I was sent this morning from the bookshop there. And there you can see the books lined up. So you can be confident if you drop in there, as long as you get there quickly, there will be some copies there today. The other two places I wanted to mention are very much people travelling in and out of Brussels, because they're new locations which we've just added. One is the relay shop in the departures at the Brussels airport. I appreciate that volumes of traffic are down a bit, but if you are passing through the airport, the relay in the departures. And the other is in the Brussels Midi, Gare du Midi station. Again, the relay shop will have copies of the book. So if you are on a flying visit to Brussels, there's three places that you can pick up both these excellent books. And with that, I'll hand you back to Nick.
Fantastic, John. Thank you very much for that. And do remember, today's seminar is just a highlight of the excellent work in both of the books. John has shared you where to get them, so we do recommend pop out to buy these books. If you haven't yet done so, you can also do so via the John Harper Publishing website. So with that in mind, you've heard enough from me. I'll hand over to Joost.
Thank you, Nick. And I think while I start, you can try to get my slides back on the screen. Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. So thank you all for joining. I'm Joost Mulder. I'm one of the co-authors of the first book, the Orange Book. I've added a few chapters there, most importantly on the European Parliament and on the ordinary legislative procedure. As most of you will know, the Parliament is a very powerful institution, particularly since the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. And if you want to have a lasting impact on EU policy making, you must engage with the European Parliament, in addition to the other institutions in Brussels, the Council and the Commission. Because even if you've done all your homework in the Commission and the Commission proposal is exactly what you want, you still need to make sure that you defend your baby during the legislative process in the Parliament and in the Council. So Parliament is a full co-legislator with an equal say, together with the Council, on roughly 95% of EU law. It can nowadays block important implementing acts. It can block trade agreements. Some of you might remember the saga of the CETA and TTIP trade agreements. It holds important budgetary powers, something that we witness right now as the Parliament is forming its own position on the EU's forthcoming multi-annual financial framework and the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And so even though the heads of state in a very symbolic July summit agreed after 4 days what would be the EU budget for the next 7 years to come, that should be really seen as a fork only within which the negotiations take place with the European Parliament. Now, in addition to formal powers, the Parliament, of course, is also a magnificent hub for media and for networking. And I realize, John, when you just said we can pick up the books in the EP bookstore, of course, a very practical problem in this is that outsiders do not have access to the European Parliament as we speak. But in normal times, and let's hope they come soon, we will again witness that hub of information sharing and gossip and buzzwords around the European Parliament. The Parliament finally also sets the agenda. The agenda is not only being set by the European Commission in the work programme, for instance, the one that was published yesterday, or by the Council through conclusions, but the European Parliament uses similar tools such as own initiative reports or parliamentary questions to try and nudge the European Commission in a certain direction. Now let's look at some of the basic dynamics in the Parliament. Nick, wake up. Yes, thank you. So compared to the Commission, it's sometimes hard to predict what happens in the Parliament. The process is more fluid, is less predictable, and even though there are formal steps, the internal dynamics really vary on a file-to-file basis. And what you're essentially playing is a multi-dimensional numbers game. One of the first things to keep in mind is the general composition of the European Parliament in terms of the political groups. As most of you will know, unlike national parliaments, the European Parliament doesn't really function in a coalition versus opposition mode, but rather forms different coalitions based on the issue at hand. Many first-timers working with the European Parliament focus too much on the nationality of MEPs. And of course, this is very important, but the group, the political group, the family of political parties at a European level is a far more important driver and predictor of what people think is important, of their positions and of their voting. And I'm pretty sure that Doru will have some statistics on that later. One anecdote from my own days, already 15 years ago, is that sometimes visitors to our offices would come and ask where the office would be of a fellow, of another famous Dutch MEP, because I was working for the Dutch Social Democrats. So I must have been sharing the floor and the elevator with them. And they were always very disappointed when they found out that that was not the case, that well, we were actually sharing a huge tower only with other Social Democrats from other countries in Europe. Now let's look at the big picture again. So those of you who've watched before know that I've said that this is the first European Parliament where the grand coalition of Socialists and Democrats and the European People's Party no longer holds a majority. And that means you need to be very creative when you build alliances, and Doru will talk about that. Now, the slide that is currently on the screen shows you the biggest delegations to political groups. This is something that is sometimes overlooked by newcomers to the European Parliament, but I think it's a very important dynamic, and it's also something that we outline in the book. All the graphs in the presentation are taken from the book, obviously. We'll start with a few extreme right parties where the numbers are highest. For instance, in the ECR group, the Law and Justice Party from Poland makes up 44% of the seats of that group, so that delegation is almost on its own determining the party line. Likewise, in the ID group, the Italian Lega makes up about 38% of the group, which is also quite a significant number. But this also applies to more mainstream groups, such as the European Greens, where 37% or 25 MEPs are from Germany. In the former Liberal group, now the Renew Europe group, as most of you will know, the Macronists, the République en Marche representatives of the Emmanuel Macron party make up 23% of this group, which is also quite a significant share. And finally, in the European People's Party, the Germans, as many times before, continue to dominate the group with a delegation of 29, but there have been 40 or more in previous parliaments. So despite the fact that European political groups don't have strong whips to discipline their MEPs because national election lists are made in the capitals, their voting behavior does represent a certain level of coherence, especially in plenary. And why is that? That is because parliamentarians derive negotiation power from it. No discipline, no power. Nobody wants to negotiate with another MEP who can't guarantee that even their own delegation will support the deal that you reach with them. That being said, there are many delegations that are outliers in their political group, and I hesitate to give examples here, but I think some of you will have heard about the heterogeneity inside the EPP group, for instance, when it comes to issues such as the rule of law. And likewise, in the Liberal group, you will find various spectrum of Liberal MEPs ranging from the French Macronist to the Dutch Liberals that tend to be more conservative and actually have two parties inside that Liberal group. And this allows us to play a popular game in advocacy land called swing delegations. Actually quite simple to play. So what I typically do in a situation like this, when, for instance, you're looking at a plenary vote and you have almost a majority of MEPs behind your cause, often you only need to swing a few MEPs to win the vote. And by listing all the delegations and identifying for each of them who is actually driving the issue, who is deciding inside the German Greens, inside the German EPP, how that particular national delegation will vote, you can often reduce a list of, say, 100 MEPs that could be potential swing voters in plenary to a handful of maybe 20 people that you need to approach because they will trail their national delegation with them. It takes a bit of work to find out who is actually driving a vote, because some delegations are so big that they have multiple MEPs on the competent committee. Other delegations will be so small that they do not have one obvious person responsible for the policy area. But if you go through delegation websites or you phone up one of the delegation assistants, you'll often quickly find out who is taking responsibility for that policy area in terms of voting list, press contacts, and the national delegations. And so I think also indeed Doru will say a lot more about group cohesion. Now, let's look briefly at the adoption process of legislation inside the European Parliament. This is going to go really quick. It's all in the book. So we're just giving you a flavor of what we're covering here and the level of detail that we're covering. As most of you know, once the Commission comes up with a legislative proposal, the Parliament's process starts in the committees. And in the book, you can read the details about how lead committees and opinion-giving committees are defined internally in the Parliament. Most of the time it's quite straightforward which committee is in charge because the proposal obviously falls in a specific defined policy area. And the first important point in this process is to understand how legislative reports are distributed among the political groups, and then how the groups name their rapporteur who leads the work in the Parliament and the shadow rapporteurs. So first the group is allocated. This is sometimes still done using a point system, and then the MEP. The rapporteur and the political group secretariat and the personal assistants are really at the center of the process in the European Parliament. Some people believe strongly in the home advantage of having an MEP that is favorable to your cause becoming the rapporteur. There is certainly a first mover advantage. but it also exposes you, and the amendments tend to be much stronger if your rapporteur shoots from the hip on your behalf. So you might get a very ambitious report supporting what you want, but the backlash in MEP amendments will be much stronger as well. And of course, there are also cases where the rapporteur ultimately asks for their name to be removed from the parliamentary report because they can no longer personally support it. All MEPs belong to at least 2 parliamentary committees, and normally each of them is specialist in some area. So you need to identify the committee most likely to deal with your issue, and then identify the most specialist MEPs on this issue within the committee. Please be aware that this does not need to be a full member of the committee. Substitute members, in terms of becoming rapporteur and getting reports, play an almost equal role. It really depends on which MEPs are active in the committee. Each group has a coordinator for each committee, and the political group coordinators for each committee meet every couple of weeks. Traditionally, the rapporteur is appointed in that meeting, in the coordinators meeting, on the basis of an auction system where groups bid points according to the number of their seats. But increasingly, more and more political groups are looking at the legislative program of the Commission, such as the one that was published yesterday for next year, and try to reach an early compromise between them on how to distribute the most important reports. MEPs who have experience on a file or an issue or are very prominent within their delegation, they of course have a bigger chance to get the most important reports. So good relation with the group coordinators in the committee is really important if you want to understand and influence this process. Then as regards rapporteurs, rapporteurs and shadow rapporteurs rely a lot on one or more of their assistants. These people can have a leading or a complementary role. Other important people are the political group advisors on the issue in question, who are generally very experienced people, both content-wise and process-wise. And finally, some of the members of the committee secretariat knowledgeable in the policy area will assist and accompany the rapporteur with research or even the drafting of the report. So you need to understand rapidly, and this varies, who exactly is working on your specific file. Now, to finish on this slide, there might also be external actors on which a rapporteur or a shadow rapporteur relies heavily to draft the report and possible amendments. This might be the Commission, this might be some national ministry official, it might be an interest group. So it's good to know who they are. And of course, it's even better if you're one of them. Establishing yourself as a source of relevant and reliable information in the European Parliament is very important in this context. Now, so back to the chart to finish it off. Once the rapporteur and the shadow rapporteurs have been named, a lot of the process actually takes place in the meetings between the shadows. There will be 1 or 2 or 3 public exchanges inside the committee, but this is only the visible tip of the iceberg. The real decisions are being taken in those shadow meetings. So you need to have some kind of informant, could be a like-minded assistant, could be a group staff member who updates you on the negotiations as they go along in those shadow meetings. Nick, if you can advance. So once the process has started, the most important date that you're actually working towards will be the deadline for tabling amendments. You need to make sure that the text you want is somewhere out there, is on the table, is being considered. And you also need to monitor the amendments tabled by shadows, often co-signed by the coordinators for extra weight, as these are more likely to be included in compromise amendments, which will of course form the backbone, the majority of the Parliament position. On the committee website, you will be able to find out when public exchanges of views are scheduled and all amendments after they've been tabled. Most paragraphs of a report will usually be covered by compromise amendments, cooked up by the shadows. So voting sessions tend to be highly predictable, except for a few decisive issues. On the day of the vote, ideally, and this of course applies to non-COVID situations, you need to be in the room to see how MEPs vote, and especially the voting instructions that the coordinators are given to the members of their political group, as most of the votes are actually simply decided by show of hands in normal situations, with no track record at all. And I think Doru later on will be able to explain how much of a frustration this is to vote watch, because it makes it impossible to capture a lot of the votes that happen in the Parliament in machine readable data. There is one exception to this rule, and that is the final vote in the committee, and any amendment on which a roll call vote is requested. This helps to mediatize your point, to ensure that MEPs follow group discipline, or actually the opposite, to entice MEPs to break ranks with their political group and show that they agree with you, otherwise you would embarrass them in the press, for instance. Now, if we look at the final slide on the plenary process, most of the time, trilogue negotiations will be taking place between that committee vote and the plenary vote, which in the end then is more important than the plenary vote, because the plenary vote is simply an endorsement of the trilogue agreement. Most reports will result in a trilogue deal, and that is described in detail in chapter 5 of the Orange Book. But in other cases, for instance, in the context of non-legislative reports, important changes might still be made at a plenary stage, since political groups, opinion-giving committees, and groups of MEPs representing more than 5% of the House can still propose those amendments. On the eve of the vote, the center of the process is actually the political group meeting, where groups as a whole decide how they vote. National delegations will sort out their differences here. This is where one delegation will say, we're sorry, Mr. Rapporteur or Shadow, Mrs. Shadow, we do not agree with your line and we want to have a free vote on this issue because this is a fundamental national issue for us and we want to vote differently. We want our voters to see that we vote differently. Here again, the quality of your contacts in the parliament is really key, literally with the people sitting in that group meeting. So that is the staff of the group and the parliamentary assistants, because they will be able to help you understand what's happening, to monitor and intervene. And on that note, I'm done with the one-on-one of chapter 3 of the book, and I'm happy to hand over to Doro for some more statistical background and the practice indeed.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joost. I think that was an excellent presentation and leads to what I'm going to say. I'm just trying to share my screen now. And if everything has gone right, then you should be seeing my screen. I think it is fundamental to mention two things at the start of my presentation, and that is that for the stakeholders or for anyone that interacts with the European Parliament and who wants to have the job done, it is very important to understand the process, and Joost has excellently presented this process and how the MEPs interact with the process and how and where the stakeholders should intervene in order to get their job done. So it is important to understand the big picture, but it is also important to understand the small picture, the micro picture, that is who are the MEPs that you're dealing with and what are their positions and how influential they are. And this is what I'm going to show in my presentation. I will start with the big picture to exemplify some of the things that Joost has pointed out, and he said that it very much depends from policy area to policy area who is going to make a coalition with whom, and there's no stable majority opposition system at the level of the EU. That is why it is very hard normally to predict what is going to happen and which way the legislation is going to go. This is why you need to understand this this big picture and understand how exactly the dynamics works in your policy area of interest. And I'm just going to give you two examples straight from the website that I'm running of Vote Watch Europe. This, for example, what you're looking at is the chart showing the degree of winning votes by each of the political groups on environmental and public health policy area. This is just to show you this, each of these pillars is one of the political groups, just to show you that even though this is EPP, and even though the EPP is by far the biggest group in the House, because it no longer has a majority, even together with the S&D, it is still very weak in some of the policy areas, especially where it finds it harder to make coalitions with other political groups. So EPP has won, for example, 75% of the votes on environment and public health, And this is almost the same as the Greens, which the Greens are, as Joost has shown, much smaller than the EPP. So despite their nominal size, the coalition dynamics works in such a way that their influence over environmental policy is at this point equal. Whereas on the other hand, Renew Europe, this is Renew Europe. Renew Europe has been on the winning side as a group in 94% of the votes on environment, so that's a lot. And the Socialists and Democrats similarly. That is because these two groups can make coalitions with both the center right or the center left, depending on how they choose at that particular vote, and that brings them in a position of kingmaker on this matter. However, just to show you a counterexample, we've been talking about environment and public health, but if we switch this to international trade, for example, we will see a completely different dynamics. You see the Greens here, the Greens on international trade. So international trade deals with everything that has to do with trade with foreign actors, such as the United States, China, Russia, Brazil, Japan, or even smaller actors like Vietnam. The Greens are almost lacking any sort of influence. That is because the other groups find it very easy to make alliances between them. Even ECR, so the Conservatives and Reformist group, have been on the winning side much more than others, because the positions of the ECR are on this particular policy area much closer to those of EPP or Renew Europe. So this is just to show that it's very, very important to understand that things can be very different from one policy area to the other. Now, what I'm going to do next is to go into the small picture and highlight why it is important to know your MEPs, or to know who exactly to go to, who is influential on the dossier that you're interested in, or in the respective policy area, but also how important it is to understand the views and the constraints of the key MEPs in your policy area in order to know who you can rely on, so who you can expect to be on your side, who you can expect to be on the opposite side, and who is still undecided. This is fundamental for any process of lobbying or advocacy. So one easy way to do it, and this is something that we're striving to do at VoteWatch Europe, is to save your time and combine a lot of pieces of information that we find from the Parliament's website. And the Parliament's website, I must say, helps a lot in most of the cases, not always. But in most of the cases, it provides a lot of information that you can compile, or you can rely on other specialized sources like VoteWatch to compile it for you, and you have a very good start. This, for example, is something that has been published quite recently, you see, just 12th of October. And it shows an update ranking of the most influential members of the European Parliament currently. Now, by this influential, we have to be very careful what we understand by it. It doesn't show the good or the bad MEPs. It just shows those who have the influence to be able to swing the decisions one way or the other, or to impose their will, or to influence their colleagues, so that at the end of the day, the shape of the legislation goes their way. Importantly, also, there are two types of influence, what we call the dissipated influence, so overall political influence over how the things are run in the European Parliament, and then concentrated influence, which belongs to those MEPs who may not be the head of the Parliament or the head of a political group, but they are running a dossier, they're steering a report in the European Parliament, so they have very concentrated influence on the direction of that dossier. This is why we've built two rankings. So this is the overall ranking on who are the most influential MEPs in the whole European Parliament. You can find it on the VoteWatch website. And not surprisingly, at the top you find those visible persons. So the President of the Parliament, some of the presidents of the political groups, but also some other rising stars from among the MEPs. And also, interestingly, we also have the top 5 new MEPs. The 2/3 of the MEPs have been replaced at the past parliamentary election. So usually the senior MEPs, so those who have been in office for more than one term, some of them have been in office for 3 or 4 terms, already, so they know things better, how they work in the European Parliament, and therefore they are more influential. The chances that they will be the rapporteurs on important files are higher. But some of the new MEPs are managing to break this glass ceiling and gain influence even from their first term, and that's these 5, for example. It's a rising star that we call Irene Tingali, or the head of the Renew Europe group, Dacian Cioloș. They are already quite influential even from the first term. Now, we have also divided this by country. So if you're looking to try to reach out to some national delegation, you can simply click through and see who is influential from among that delegation. But importantly, I would say one should start from here, from looking at the MEPs who are influential in a specific policy area, because they are the ones who hold the concentrated influence, and probably these are the ones that you care about. We addressed 6 policy areas here, but we hope to expand this to something bigger in the future. And you're probably wondering how did we reach the conclusion of who is influential? Of course, the methodology is all there. I'm just going to tell you that we are looking at the positions that they are holding. So the leadership positions on the one hand, then the contribution, the actual contribution that they do to dossiers. So whether they are rapporteurs, shadow rapporteurs, as Just has mentioned, these are important positions. Whether they're in minority or in majority when they're voting, it is very important to understand if an MEP is more central within his or her political party or group, or rather peripheral, in which case he or she can exert a smaller influence over dossiers. So this is something that we're looking at. And lastly, it's also the political network. How influential they are within their party, within their group, but also whether they have links with their national government, which in some cases, especially in the case of the MEPs coming from big countries like Germany or France, it is very important, and it helps a lot, it helps them a lot to be influential. So if you belong to the Merkel CDU or Macron's En Marche, then you already start from a stronger position to be influential in the parliament. So that is to say that you really need to start with looking at who is influential, who is likely to hold influence on your policy area. But then it is also fundamental, and this is something that many, even some of the specialized stakeholders miss. It is very, very important to understand the actual views on those MEPs. Because if an MEP is influential, but his or her views are completely opposite to what you need to support to your agenda, then it's completely useless to go to that MEP. You're not going to convince him or her of changing their views that easily, unless you come up with something extraordinary in terms of arguments or information. Otherwise, what you need to do is obviously to try to approach those MEPs who are closer to your points of view and who are more likely to be helpful. And in order to do so, in order to understand whereabout they stand, we have developed the influence matrices, which look at both the level of influence and the views of the MEPs. I'm just going to give you 2 examples. One is on trade. So this chart shows, for example, whereabout each of the MEPs stands on promoting free trade, helping the EU to promote free trade agenda. So negotiating and signing trade agreements with third parties like the United States, like Mercosur, or even with China or smaller countries like Vietnam. So those to the right of this chart, you see it says stronger support, so they support freer trade, whereas those to the left of it, they are more protectionist in general, and they are usually opposing these trade agreements or specific parts of the trade agreements. And then on the vertical, you see whether these MEPs are more influential or not. That is, you see in the case of trade, for example, you just scroll your mouse over one of the MEPs and you see where this MEP stands. This MEP, for example, is fairly influential and it's quite convinced that free trade is the way to go in international affairs. On the opposite side, you have this green MEP here, German MEP, which is also fairly influential, but is very skeptical about the benefits of opening up international trade. And a lot of people are in between. Let's take this key MEP here, Kathleen van Bremt, for example, a Belgian socialist, who is right on the majority line, if you see. That means there are 50% of the MEPs to her right and 50% of the MEPs to her left. That means that she's in a very good position to swing the votes one way or the other, depending on how exactly the vote is phrased, whether it is the strength of an amendment. That is what will determine the way she will go, but also how the lobbyists and the campaigners will make their case. Yeah, so our advice in general is to look at all of these MEPs in this zone, which are on the one side and the other of the majority line, and which are not convinced. They are sometimes undecided until the very last moment, whether we're talking about a vote in the plenary or about a vote in a committee. And you can also filter this by country and look only at the German MEPs, for example. You will see where the Germans stand and who is the closest to the majority line. Or you can look only at the MEPs belonging to a particular group if you like to lobby the Renew Europe MEPs, for example. And then that chart was for the plenary as a whole, but you can also break this down by a specific committee. These are only the MEPs who belong to the INTA committee, so are members of the specialized committee, and you see whereabout they stand in terms of influence. Let's look at this. Bernd Lange, obviously, for those who work with International Trade Committee, they know that he's been in office for long and he's very influential. And he is a moderate, so he can oppose or support a trade provision depending on what this is exactly about. And then you can look at specific subjects such as the trade agreement with Vietnam, for example. And here you see whereabout the MEPs stand on opening trade with Vietnam. So this can be tailor-made according to specific agreement. Secondly, and very quickly, it is the same on the climate agenda. You see here, similar chart. The MEPs to the right are those who support a stronger and accelerated prioritization of the climate agenda, and those to the left are those who are more in favor of a gradual approach. Nobody here is necessarily against the environment, obviously, and this is something that you have to pay attention, but some want a more accelerated prioritization of the climate agenda, whereas others have other concerns, such as the effects on the economy. And here, this chart shows you whereabout they stand, but also how much influence they exert over dossiers that relate to the climate agenda, for example. The last thing that I want to show you, I think, is one of the components of the influence, and that is which MEPs are very good at effectively developing political networks in the European Parliament and getting things done. And one, as I said, we looked at many criteria to see who is influential, but one key criterion is the degree in which they manage to reach out to other MEPs when drafting their amendments at the committee stage. And we noted rather different behavior within the political groups, with some MEPs drafting a lot of amendments, but not being able to reach out to other political groups or other nationalities. In a very fragmented parliament, and as used correctly pointed out, that now the parliament is very fragmented. Not even EPP and the socialists hold a majority together. Therefore, it is very important to be able to reach out to other groups and to build compromises. So here we looked at who are those MEPs who are able to reach out to others from other groups, so to bring them on board to increase the chances of an amendment being adopted. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also looked at the MEPs who are able to bring on board some of their fellow colleagues from with other nationalities, because even if you're a German, for example, and you have a lot of other German MEPs on your side, it will not be enough if you get all the Germans on your side to pass an amendment. You also need to get the Spanish, the Italians, and others. So this is why we highlighted here in this report which are the MEPs who are better at building transnational networks or cross-group networks in order to pass their amendments. And the same thing, you scroll your mouse over them and you see who these are. They're not necessarily those who are very visible. Some of them are, but some of them are less visible because they are less preoccupied by their social media accounts, for example, but more preoccupied by developing their internal network in the European Parliament. So this is very, very important to know who to reach and who is more likely to be a hub. So if you get one of these MEPs who is very good at building bridges in the Parliament, then an important part of your job has been done, because he or she holds a lot of leverage of propagating effectively those views into the dossier. All right, I will stop here so that we also take some questions. I'm looking forward to have a lively discussion forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Doro from Vote Watch. Thank you very much for that very interesting overview there of the work that you are doing and the information that you can provide. Thank you also to Joost for his presentation. We now come to our Q&A session. And we've had some couple of questions already. I'm going to go to a question from Richard Corbett first, and then a follow-up from Yorgos Vassalos. So from Richard Corbett, who do you consider to be the more influential in a committee dealing with legislation, the group coordinators or the rapporteur and shadow rapporteur? So Joost, should I hand that one over to you? You're on mute, Joost.
With pleasure. I'm back on now. Yeah. And of course, it's highly dangerous responding to an MEP with, I think, 25-year experience in doing this. But Richard, I'll try anyway. I think it really depends on the issue. The coordinators are quite good still at defending long-term horizontal policy lines. So on major cross-file issues, you might find that the coordinators actually exert quite a lot of pressure. But of course, on individual pieces of legislation, the negotiating team, as it's called, so the rapporteur and the shadow rapporteurs, they pretty much decide what happens, including in the shadow meetings and in trilogues as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. And the follow-up then is, so could it be more effective, this is from Yorgos, to propose an amendment to a shadow rapporteur rather than the rapporteur?
Yeah, that one is a qualified answer as well, I think. It depends on how ambitious, how extraordinary your amendment is. If it is straightforward, it might be easier to get it in through the rapporteur, let sleeping dogs lie and wait until it sails through the compromise amendments and use that first mover's advantage. If it is highly controversial, it might be easier not to raise too much suspicion, not get it in the draft report, but to get another MEP, and indeed preferably a shadow rapporteur, to table it and to make it a red line in the compromise negotiations and insist that it becomes part of the compromise package.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And yours, just to let you know, Richard has popped into the chat that was a good answer. So you got a tick of approval there.
Thank you.
The question from Doru from Domenico. Do you produce the analyses during the legislative process or only once it's concluded?
No, we produce the analysis continuously, and what you have seen is something that we have done, started doing now over the summer, and these will be updated as things evolve throughout the parliamentary term. Now, it is very important to understand one fact for those who work with big numbers and with predictions. It is critical to understand history in order to predict the future. That's the only way in which you can predict what's going to happen, by looking at the patterns in which things have happened in the past on similar dossiers. Many people, many of our partners, they tell us, all right, that's what happened in the past, but what's going to happen in the future? And my answer always is, if you want to know what's happening in the future, you really need to understand what's happened in the past, because that is, no, you have to have a solid basis from which to start. And then, of course, you have to integrate what the differences between then and now are. Maybe there have been some strong lobbying campaign on one of the sides which have modified the positions of the political players. But otherwise, you need to keep a very close monitoring of any shifts in the positions, especially on very politicized or on increasingly politicized topics, such as now the environment, the public health, or digital, which is now a big hot topic, and many players are applying pressures onto both the European Commission and the MEPs, and it is very important to monitor and see how they shift their positions on issues such as data privacy, digital sovereignty, for example. This is a very important battleground, and many of the political players are yet undecided on these matters, and it is key to follow them. So to answer you, this is a longitudinal approach, so an ongoing update.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Doru. There was a question from Caroline, but I think Ilinka has answered that question in the chat for her.
Briefly come in.
Yes,
sorry,
Nick, if you want to add anything.
Just to supplement the answer, that link indeed points to the committee chairs and vice chairs. I was talking about the coordinators, the political group coordinators. So on most of the thematic committee homepages that you can find on the European Parliament website, so you go to the Parliament website and then you click on committees and you find the committee you're interested in, you will find a listing of the coordinators, or you will find a nice PDF, a Facebook basically, called Welcome Pack for new MEPs, so you know who's in charge in that committee. Alternatively, if the committee doesn't publish it, you can go to the political group websites and look for the listing of the coordinators for all committees, but then you have to compile a list for the committee yourself.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Joost. Another question for Joost from regarding how do you build contacts in the EP? Should more focus be on the APAs rather than the MEPs?
Yes, I mean, APAs, Assistant Parlementaire Assistant, mixing up the languages, are the gatekeepers to parliamentarians. I think few of you have mobile numbers of MEPs, and in these COVID days, it is almost essential to be able to get in touch with parliamentary staff and MEPs on a personal basis. So you need to befriend APAs.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. We come on to a question from Aaron. Why do so many focus on their own country's MEPs rather than those who have influence? Doru, is that something you're happy to jump in on?
Yeah, I think it's a natural reflex that we have as humans to go and try to approach those people who look like us, speak like us, or move like us, and they're from the same cultural sphere. Also, these persons are more visible to us because we meet them, we go in the same circles, so we feel more comfortable approaching them. However, this is not necessarily always the best approach. Just because they come from the same country doesn't mean that they will have the right views like ourselves on that dossier. So it is very important to be able to expand your spectrum and understand that in a union with 27 countries, your allies may be easily elsewhere, and you have, and this is the experience that we have had with many of our partners, there are hidden allies all over the place that you may not be aware of. And especially now after Brexit, we have got a lot of questions from those stakeholders who used to use the British as their channels in the European Parliament, saying, what should we do now? Who should we go to? And the answer to that is very diverse from one policy area to another. There can be the closest to the position of the British on various subjects can be among the Czechs, for example, among the Portuguese, among the Romanians, or the Dutch or the Swedish. So it's the right question, who should you go to in the absence of the British? And the answer can be very different.
Thank you very much for that, Doro. We come to a question from Alessandro. How do you think the advocacy world is shifting due to the current digital obligations? And what would be a few tips and tricks to engage with the European Parliament in this particular situation? Now, if I may jump in very quickly, I think the first tip and trick would be to buy both of the books in the first instance, because that will help you very much with guidance on the matter. Joost, are you happy to jump in on this question?
No, to be honest, I think this is more a question for the purple book. So I'm happy to pass this one on to Doro.
Okay.
Well, what I can say from my perspective is that this increasing digitalization of the institutions is helping us from the perspective of having much more data, much more information than we had before. Now, all of the votes in the plenary are by roll call vote, which increased something like 50% the data sets that we have, which help us and those working with us to understand much more of where the MEPs stand on all of the issues. So from this perspective, it is helpful that there is much more very reliable information available. And by the way, that's why I call my organization VoteWatch, because the votes are by far the single most important piece of information in order to understand where the MEPs stand. Parliamentary questions are important, speeches are important, but when you really want to know where they stand and whether they are your allies or not, then look at the votes. Now, from another perspective, from the perspective of the meetings, obviously it is much harder and it is more difficult to get the MEPs to talk to you and approach them and get things done. So from the action perspective, it is more difficult, and you have to improvise and adapt to this. But on the other hand, what I'm hearing from the MEPs is that because they do not have to travel, they're not wasting a lot of time on the road. That also means that they have more time for virtual meetings, whether they are on one-on-one or joint meetings with others. So there are advantages and disadvantages. At the end of the day, you still have to go through their assistance, as Joost was pointing out, to get through them. So good luck with that.
Thank you very much for that answer, Doro. I'm going to combine a question from Julie and Thomas with regards to intergroups. So Thomas has asked about, can you elaborate on the specific influence of intergroups and committee presidents? And Julie's question is, can you talk about intergroups and whether they have significant influence? I think we can answer that as one. Who would like to come in on that one?
I'm happy to pick that one up actually in conjunction with the question by Sanjeev, because the answer is you need to distinguish between influencing the Parliament on concrete legislative procedures and agenda setting. And the two, I mean, they're interlinked, but the advocacy tools that you use are different. So to answer Sanjeev's question, one important tool for parliamentarians to set the Commission agenda, to influence it, is the use of own initiative reports, but also plenary resolutions or more general interventions can be used to push the Commission in a certain action. And that is also where intergroups fit in. Intergroups are just another tool in the toolbox to set the agenda. That is not the same as influencing a legislative process.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. A question from Dimitris, and that's for Doro. What are the background criteria and data used in the website you showed us to conclude on this? You showed us to conclude on the nice graphs.
So briefly, I talked about two things. First of all, the level of influence of the MEPs. And as I said, for those, we looked at something like 20-something criteria, ranging from their positions as rapporteurs, shadows, coordinators, and others in the committees, in the respective area, the networks that they have with within their parties, within their groups, so whether they occupy positions in these, whether they belong to parties in government, whether looking at their views, they are more peripheral or central within their parties, as well as their ability to, as I've showed, to reach out when drafting amendments to big diversity of other political players from other countries and other nationalities. So that regards the influence, whereas on the views, we look at how they voted on votes that were in a specific area. As I said, the climate agenda or trade or taxation is coming soon. We're going to publish this defense, probably we're going to publish it this week, how they position themselves on integrating the European defense, for example. So these are very objective and reliable pieces of information. We do not take a judgmental approach. We just map the positions of the MEP so that you know where they stand.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Doru. I think on that we can draw the webinar to an end. I'd like to say a massive thank you to Doru Francescu, founder and CEO of Vote Watch Europe, Joost Mulder of Better Europe Public Affairs. I hope that everyone found today's seminar interesting. And thank you very much to the very good questions as well. The recording for today's presentation will be available via the John Harper Publishing website. As a final plea from me, I do request to pop out and buy the 2 books. They are really useful and interesting and fascinating pieces of work, and John Harper shared with you at the beginning where you can find them in person, but also they're available via the John Harper Publishing website. The next webinar will be on the 3rd of November on engaging the Council of the EU. So do please sign up as well, encourage your colleagues to do so. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much, Doru. Thank you very much, Joost. And thank you, John Harper, as well. And I hope the rest of you have a lovely week. Goodbye.